as clouds that veil the midnight moon, how restlessly they speed and gleam and quiver, streaking the darkness radiantly, yet soon night closes around and they are lost forever. Mutability by P. Shelley. The Romantic Age. The moment we think of Romantic Age, we think of all those great poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Shelley and Byron, and oh my God, we could go on and on. But what is so important about the Romantic Age? It was a total breakaway from the previous age. The poets believed in subjectivity, in going back to nature, in the simplicity of language, and writing from their hearts, feelings. That's what it all was about. And therefore you have I wandered lonely as a cloud, or you have my heart aches. We are looking at this poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Sad indeed that he died an early death, shipwrecked on his way to Italy from England. And he grew more famous after his death. His poems came to be appreciated better. Many critics and readers look at Shelley as, in a way, writing against the canon. Socially, politically, he had very strong ideas. And let's not forget, he was after all a child of his age, and therefore liberty was important to him. Of course, he wrote nature poems, and we think of the skylark or the west wind. But please remember, he also wrote the famous Prometheus Unbound, where he's talking about man's right to liberty, getting fire from the heavens so that man could be just as wrong. He also had a play to his credit called Cenci, C-E-N-C-I. That is the great Shelley. Mutability. The word itself might make us wonder, what is it all about? Mutability is change. Mutability is variability. And remember the great quote, the only constant is change. That's what this poem deals with. After all, Shelley was a nature poet, and therefore the poem begins with a beautiful natural scene. We are as clouds veil the midnight moon, how restlessly they speed and gleam and quiver, streaking the darkness radiantly, yet soon night closes around, and they are lost forever. I'm sure each one of us remembers those beautiful sky scenes, night scenes if you please. 1 second you feel the moon is shining ever so bright, and then the clouds appear and the moon seems to disappear, and just as soon the clouds disappear, the moon appears again, and each time the sight is different. So that's what Shelley is talking about here. Maybe it's about our joys, which are fleeting, but remember, sorrows are equally fleeting. And then he goes on to talking about how each human being looks at the past, remembers the past, and therefore when he is talking about the past, the musical instrument that comes to his mind is the lyre. L-Y-R-E, remember, it's an ancient stringed musical instrument. Not so common today. Today you might think of the guitar or the sitar or the violin or the veena and much more. But because he's talking about the past, he uses the lyre, and he says, like some forgotten lyre whose dissonant strings, the word dissonant indicates that it's slightly out of tune. So maybe we are not thinking of joys, we are not thinking of happiness, maybe we are thinking of the sorrows of the past. And each one responds to the past in a different way. So it gives various responses, he says. And one mood could last fleetingly for a little while. Don't forget, the title of the poem is Mutability, change. And then he says, we go to sleep, we dream, And probably when we go to sleep, we are thinking of wonderful dreams. We are thinking of probably traveling across the world or maybe even above the earth. But what happens? Sometimes it could be nightmares. So instead of joyous dreams, he says, we could have dreams which frighten us, which probably make us wake up. And then he says, we could laugh or we could weep. Each time Shelley is reminding us that joy and sorrow are like two sides of the same coin. It is the same, he says in the last verse. Be it joy or sorrow, the path of departure still is free. This goes on in our lives till our death. And we can't choose our moment of death, but it comes to each one of us through this life, after this life. We have looked at the poem. We have tried to understand the basic themes that Shelley is talking about here. And then we must move on to the figures of speech. Remember, that's so important almost in every poem that we read. In fact, if you go to your nursery rhymes, maybe you could find some figures of speech even there. But I'm talking about Mutability by P.B. Shelley. The most common figure of speech is, of course, the simile, the comparison, remember. And he begins with, we as clouds. The word as makes it clear that it's not a metaphor. We as clouds, so you have the word of comparison, and therefore it's a simile. When we look at a poem, we could have figures of speech which are related to the meaning, and we could have figures of speech which are related to the sound. So let me talk about a couple of figures of speech related to the sound. So you have assonance, for example, right? You have alliteration, for example. They keep coming in poem after poem. I'm going to talk about a figure of speech which is not very common. The word caesura. It comes from the word cease. You probably know the word cease. C-E-A-S-E. You know, when something stops. So we have in places where the poet stops in the middle of a line and then continues. So if you look at your last stanza, it is the same. And then there's a dash. For be it joy or sorrow. This is called a caesura. And then we have repetition. When you have the same sound being repeated again and again. The same word, the same sound, sound for meaning. And then, of course, you have a paradox. When you have two opposites in meaning being placed next to each other. Restlessly they speed, he talks about. He talks about feel and conceive. They might seem like paradoxes because remember, feeling is to do with the heart and conceive is to think, is to do with the head. The rhyme scheme in these 4-line stanzas is quite simple. A-B, A-B. What does it mean? The first line, last word, rhymes with the third line, last word. The second with the fourth. So if you just look at the first verse, you've got moon and soon, and you've got quiver and ever. One question that you might be left with after looking at the meaning and also looking at the figures of speech is it an optimistic poem or is it a pessimistic poem? That's what makes a poem great. Each time you read it, you come with a new meaning to the word. Isn't that right? Optimistic or pessimistic? Let's see what you feel about it. Having looked at the poem, let's see where do we go from here. It's very important for us to appreciate a poem, but I think more importantly, the poem should lead us on into more poems. And what poems would you like to read? I think you should look at nature poems. I think you should look at poems like The Daffodils, one of the most favorite romantic poems. Down the years, you might read it in school books, in college books, you might read it just for the fun of it. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Look at a simple poem by Keats like I Had a Dove. And of course, read other poems by Shelley. A poem which is very different from this, but yet which talks about change, is a poem called the Ozymandias. Try and read that poem. And of course, the romantic poets are unimaginably exciting to read because you can read them without help, without a teacher, without a parent, without an elder guiding you. And I think that is the best appreciation of a poem. Do remember to read the poem aloud because the sound, remember, is as important as the meaning of any poem that you read and want to appreciate. It is the same. For be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow, naught may endure but mutability.